talk out of a series of 5 that we're going to do at the Anchorage Museum. So, le ka klenach Meda DeWitt yuchat duasak, Tlingit klenach zetzinok, and ka klat yuchat duasak, nanyaina chatzati, kachadi yari chatzati, shtakin kwan ayachat. My English name is Meda DeWitt. My Tlingit names are Kak Klat and Zetzinok. And I have adopted a Nubak name of Tegigiluk and adopted Cree name of Boss Eagle Spirit Woman. My family comes from Wrangell and Yakutat, and I also have Tahltan from Glenora, BC. And I'm obviously mixed, and so I have a lot of Irish and Scottish and Norwegian and some other things that we have to explore later. I am the child of the Kachedi, and I'm the grandchild of the Tluk Nachadi from Yakutat and the Tiatan from the Wrangell area. Uh, my family names are DeWitt, Paul, Jones, Tamarie, Weiser, Peterson, and Goodrich. And I currently live in South Central with my fiance, Chris Pioli, and our combined 8 children. One's out on his own, and the other 7 are at home. So I would like to start first with I ask for your forgiveness if I make any mistakes this evening. It is not my intention. My intention is to share what I have learned for others to learn from and to grow with. I'd like to give gratitude to Marion DeWitt, Shawat Klein, who is Kachadi, my grandmother. She has passed a few years ago, but she really instilled the sense of identity in me in a way that I needed the most. And not only did she give me permission to be who I am, but she said, just go out and enjoy it. And she gave me the family stories and really helped to create a way to think about culture and share the stories of our grandparents. So, what she shared with me is that they worked their whole lives for the right to be native. And she's talking about Tilly Paul Tamarie and Charlie Jones, Chief Shakes. She's talking about William and Louis Paul and people who dedicated their whole lives to serve the Tlingit people and to fight for our rights. And she said, honey, they spent their whole lives fighting for the right to be Tlingit. It's your job to go out and enjoy being Tlingit. And that's really set the course for pretty much my entire adult life and figuring out what does that mean and how do we access culture to enjoy it, right? And she would tell me that their lament in their old age is that they gave up too much in their whole lives fighting to be accepted and to have the right to vote and have land claim settlements and the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood that they engaged in so deeply. Their lament at the end of life was that they gave up too much for the right to be citizens and that they want some of it back. And so that's what informs our work today, right? Bringing it back. I'd like to also give gratitude to Linda DeWitt, Ajit, my auntie. She also shares stories with me and lessons and gives me approvals if I'm on the right track or teaches me and guides me if I'm off track a little bit. I'm eternally grateful for that. I'd also like to give gratitude to Margaret Gross Hope, also known as DeWitt with her maiden name. She is actually my great auntie. She's also my namesake daughter. So my born name, Tsetsinok, was her mother's name. And then my adult name was given to me by Susan Ramsey, who is head woman of Nanyai. And she shared with me her name, Kat Klat, as honor and recognition and proper naming. So I'm very grateful for that. And also Judy Ramos Dakhutsu. Forgive me if I said that wrong. I apologize. But Judy is always humble and kind and a wealth of knowledge that I'm grateful for. And also, in this journey of rites of passage and study, I have had stories shared with me from women from Alaska and Canada and Lower 48, from our First Nations and our Alaska Native people and American Indian people and Hawaiian and Indigenous people from all over, women sharing their stories about traditional rites of passage and what does it mean to be an Indigenous woman. So I carry those stories with me like a blanket that we wear and to help us teach our next generations. Some of the information that I'll be sharing in here is actually from the Rites of Passage pilot project in 2012 that was conducted with advisors Rosa Miller, Jackie Schopert, and Della Cheney, and Charlotte Silverly. Ganesh Cheesh, Ganesh Cheesh, Ganesh Cheesh for your wisdom and guidance in the process. That was it was a coming of age ceremony, even though we were adult women. It was a lot of work and so worth it. So, next. I wanted to make sure that we recognize Yeti Olson. He actually is the builder for this space. When I was actually surprised because the museum, I said, I want to make a women's house. And at first it was no, but Francesca, she went to bat and she was like trying to find a way to create this. And she worked with Adam and Julie, and they actually got the approval to create this space for the North by North exhibit. And we started for the structures exhibit, which is this one in September. And Yaith Yeti, I asked him, it was short notice, and I said, can you please help me with this project? You're my opposite. You're a builder. You have experience in theater and building for theater. And this is what I want. I want to make a woman's house. And I need somebody who can help me create this. And he was on board 150% from the beginning, and positive and knowledgeable and kind and humble and giving with his time. And I'm very grateful for you, Yeti. I would also like to give gratitude, Ganashchi, Shinchinan, to the Dena'ina people, for we are in Anchorage and we're at the Anchorage Museum, which is traditionally Dena'ina land. So the process of revitalizing culture, it's a journey, both internally and externally, because culture is not a static thing. It's not past tense. And even the term traditional healer, people sometimes have this anticipation that you are going to be living in the past. And that's not the case. Our people were dynamic and adaptable, right? Resiliency, that's the key word that everybody uses nowadays. But that was part of our core culture, was taking the best practices and identifying what makes the most sense, right? What is practical? What benefits the people and the environment and is in alignment with spirit and for the next generations to come? And so to work in this process of revitalizing culture and identity, you have to look in the past and look at how it translates present, and also how is it going to translate in the future. You have to spend time with elders and culture bearers, and you have to research, and there's different kinds of research, and we'll talk more about that later. You also have to take the time to meditate and pray. Those are very important parts of our culture. And when you sit with something, you learn with it, but it's like our stories. When you hear your story from your elder, and there's layers of understanding and knowledge, and many of those layers take time to unfold. You could be told a story at age 5. That airplane's coming through. But you could be told a story at age 5, and the same story at age 25, and the same story at 55, and the same story at 75. And that story is going to have different meanings and each telling, because the way that they were formatted, they did not have static morals. They had dynamic morals. So the moral wasn't given. You had to incorporate it within yourself and understand the teaching that that story is giving you, because it's a living transmission of knowledge and understanding. And what I've found through working with my mentors and elders is a lot of the stories don't necessarily tell you exactly what to do, but they tell you how to think, or teach you how to think more appropriately. And so you have to learn how to think in a way that incorporates, these oral traditions, that incorporates science, that incorporates worldview, and incorporates common sense. I remember um, when I realized about our traditional scratchers. So traditionally, you weren't supposed to pick and scratch because it was a sign of, internal agitation or not having a lot of discipline. So we traditionally would wear implements on a long cord that you would use if you really did have an itch that needed to be scratched. And it's recorded by the explorers that this implement was a taboo, right? And it bothered me, and sometimes those things, they stick with you, and they bother you, and they just kind of follow you around for a while. And I read that about the same time that I was in my Bachelor of Science of Nursing at UAA. And we had read that doctors realized that they had to wash their hands between working on cadavers and delivering babies. Because in the mid to late 1800s, doctors didn't know, Western doctors didn't know that they had to wash their hands after working on dead people before going and delivering babies. And when they started washing their hands between working on cadavers and delivering babies, the mortality rate of the mothers and infants significantly dropped. Now, when I saw the date that triggered that piece of information that had been bothering me, and that piece of information was that the explorer, like you said, the scratchers were taboo, but that was written in 1848, about exactly the same time or just before doctors realized they had to wash their hands. So what I realized was that that explorer who was documenting that process did not have common knowledge of transferable disease and bacteria, and that we were implementing a public health safety measure by people having their own personal scratching implement. And so once you start taking these different domains of understanding and applying them to traditional culture, things start to make a lot more sense. And you start to marvel at the genius of our ancestors, who were in a state of being for long enough that they were able to observe human behavior and actions and then define culture that was best practices. And so the culture has this process of being sensible, right? So we have all these different kind of taboos, but that's because they were put through a lens of non-sense or non-common sense, because it's taken a few hundred years for empirical information in the Western medical system to start catching up with our traditional knowledge and understanding of ways of being. I also have in here to discuss with peers and mentors. And it's very important to have people that you can work with and to share information and ideas. And also, the good friends that will call BS on you if you're off on the wrong track, or, help you to understand when you are on the right track, or to add in the information and knowledge that they've learned themselves. And so all of this, we'll talk about it more later within this process. But for this first session, what we're doing is we're talking about kind of this literature review and the anthropological process and academic process. And then for the next sessions, the talks that we're going to have, we're actually going to have other Tlingit women with us to discuss what does it mean to be an Indigenous woman, a Tlingit woman, and the different stages of life. So the literature review is a process that I had to go through in preparation for the pilot project. And also I wrote this up for a capstone at APU for a bachelor's project. And what I found was, there was mostly explorers or anthropologists who have written about this subject, and not very many contributions from cultural members. And when you have explorers and anthropologists, especially in the 1800s, mid 1800s to early 1900s, it's going to be men interviewing men, right? And what are they going to look at? They're going to look at physical structures, and they're going to be limited in their understanding of protocol and purpose. Why? This is a woman's house. So in our traditional way, the men would have built this. Yethiadi and I engaged in a traditional practice of, he is a raven and my opposite, and he built this, and we worked together to build it. And I have gifted him, and I have paid him dana and abalone and tools. So you have to pay your builders well. My grandmother, Jenny Billy, she was married to Tall Tan Billy, who was a Tall Tan chief, but he came to the coast down Telegraph Creek. So Kiksadi, Jenny Billy, she actually would bake bread and sell bread to the miners, and they would pay her in gold dust. And so when they paid her in gold dust, she would save that away and saved it away until she had enough to build her house. And so she had her opposites build the house, and she paid them. And it says at the potlatch in the family stories that she had the gold miners, their pans, the gold mining pans, it was full of gold dust, and she had potlatch spoons, and she scooped it. And that's how she paid her opposites, with scoops of gold dust that she had earned through baking bread. And so we always take care of our opposites when they help us. But those kinds of protocols, they're not written in the explorers or the anthropologist accounts, because they didn't necessarily have access to the language in depth at the time. And they weren't interested necessarily in women's business. So there's later accounts about the reciprocity, and you'll find that in some of the works. But there's not a lot mentioned about the women's house. And so what we did find, this is basically the collection of what we found in the women's house, and it's referenced many times. But normally with the seclusion huts, they were more fascinated with the seclusion hut than the actual Shawat hit. So their accounts, 6x6 structure made out of hemlock boughs, 1 week to 1 year in duration, tended by female family members, pierced in the lip with a labret when they were done, and it then symbolized their social status, and they were able to be marriageable. They would fast depending on the duration. So depending on your caste, you would either be in for 1 week or 1 year, or a variation in between. And so for 1 week, you would fast for the duration, but for a year, that doesn't make sense, does it? So every 5 days, they would eat superfood that was prepared. And the superfood would be seal oil, dried salmon, and blueberries. And that would keep them going. So every 5 days, they would have the meal of this superfood. So they could come out at night if they were wearing a hat. And a lot of times it was to stretch their legs and to get fresh air. They would wear an implement to scratch with. We talked about that earlier. Random accounts of activities without explanation of purpose. So that was a big thing, is they would highlight information in their texts that was so random. It doesn't make sense. And one of the things that I had an elder tell me was sometimes the elders would tease the explorers, and they would tell them really wild information as a joke, but the anthropologist or explorer didn't have the insight of the humor, And so they would write it down as an account, like this wild account of what was happening. So after the duration of seclusion, the young woman would get new clothes. There would be a potlatch in her honor, and there'd be a celebration by the community. And then, of course, like I said, with the libre, she would be able to marry once it was completed. And something about slaves, it was one gentleman kind of rambled on about slaves getting new clothing or being released, but it's not something that is given in context for making a lot of sense. But from this side of things, it's like, yes, it was a celebration. So there would be giving and generosity and acts of kindness because the family would be celebrating their wealth of this daughter coming to age as a young woman who would then be able to have children. Extremely biased, and some of the comments are blatantly racist, which anybody who does research in our traditions knows what I'm talking about. So I really appreciated Frederica de Laguna and her take on the information because she compiled a lot of these explorer accounts, and she even notes in her work that their accounts weren't accurate, or they were kind of conflated and biased or racist. Jenny Reddish has done some writing on it, and this is the lit review. Like I said, there wasn't a whole lot on it, and so this is kind of the base of the female writers that I could find. Now these are non-native female writers. So Jenny quotes Aldana, and they talk about our lip plates and how there's also another tribe in the Amazon who have lip plates. And then they hyper focus on the pain. And I think that they miss the fundamental purpose of the teaching, because for people who've had piercings, and especially traditionally, they would pinch it so that way it would numb the skin, so there wasn't actually a lot of pain. And piercings in themselves are not hyper painful, especially if you're a traditional person. I have Nora Downhauer on the next page, and to quote her, she said, they don't make them like they used to. So the amount of pain that you would have experienced with the libret wasn't enough to change you in some way that they're talking about. So from my observations and the plates, that had to do with at first the libret, and then as you were older and higher caste, you would actually get larger plates placed in your lip. And I think that has to do with their social standing and the weight of their words, right? The larger plate, the higher caste, the more elder they are, the heavier their words and the more weight that people have to experience them with. So if you have a high caste woman with a large plate who's going to speak, everybody better be quiet and listen and carry it out in the way that she presents it. And then there's another writer, Linda, who talks about Do Glaciers Listen? And it talks about a young woman going through menses and the seclusion rites and the elder story discussing the process. And in that story, that actually, because she looks at the glacier and it's a traditional story and it's written out, the glacier ends up galloping and it comes forward and the people have to leave quickly, and it starts a migration story. So they're all female, which if you go into feminist research, it actually makes a difference because you're getting closer to the actual understanding of the women's house. But then when you get into the members of the culture who write about this, there's only a few. Nora Downhauer is one. And then Liz Medicine Crow has an article that she wrote when she was in college of a story from her mother, and it's beautiful. And Nora's story, that she writes in Hashuka, our ancestors, it's poetic, it has depth of understanding, right? It's living insight and connectivity. And actually, I was able to speak with Nora at one of our clan conferences, and she shared with me her story and experience of rites of passage. But I cannot, she said, I cannot share that one with other people, but I get to hold it myself. But her writing that is public is that this is one of the great miracles and mysteries of life. And in many traditional societies, women were and are considered to have great power, especially at this time. The power can also be unconscious and dangerous, and many ritual taboos often apply. In traditional societies, the onset of menstruation is one of the great rites of passage in a woman's life and in the life of the community. So, menstruation is a blessing, right? It is a rite of passage for a community. It means the continued life and birth of future generations. So, what is a rite of passage, right? It's a ceremony or an event that is an important stage in someone's life, especially birth, puberty, marriage, and death. We talked about earlier about the Tlingit people and the mastery of initiation and cultivation or intervention on biological processes. A lot of the information about the traditional taboos or ways of being, you can actually correlate with biological processes and best practices. So they augment life's natural rhythms and cycles, facilitating necessary actions to ensure successful transition into new identity, responsibilities, and expectations. There's also in Joseph Campbell's writing and other psychology writing that process of going away and then coming back. And then when you come back, it's acknowledged that you're now a new person. You're the same person, but you're new, right? You're an adult, you're marriageable, you have new responsibilities. People don't treat you as a child anymore. And so that going away and coming back is actually a very important process in the recognition. And this is in boys' rites of passage and girls' rites of passage. And then menstruation or gan, right? Shawat. These are Tlingit words for us to learn. I am not a fluent language speaker. I am a learner, and so I incorporate them when I can. All right, so the project. In 2012, we had a gathering of women in Southeast Alaska to go through rites of passage together. And this gathering was a culmination of years long and, in some cases, lifelong journeys of elder interviews, research, planning, preparation for the event. The experience was deemed highly valuable by the participants and assisted in their personal growth process. They also viewed the return of rites of passage as fundamental to the healing of their community and culture. The purpose of the paper was to create a foundational review of literature, and this is actually for everybody to use, not just for myself, but a foundational literature review and a document the participatory action research event known as the Women's Rites of Passage, and it's to serve as a building block. It is not the definitive end all to be all. It is just a tool for people to use and to gather from. And that's part of the living culture, is we have to work together to create it. So there's different methods of research, right? There's Western methods of research, and in this case, there's applied research, there's problem solving research, there's qualitative and ethnographic research. We talked about the feminist research methods, right? It's for women by women. And then there's the indigenous research methodology. And thankfully, there's many books out there, not a lot, but several books out there on indigenous research that people can access. And it's a personal experience and understanding. There's literature review, there's interview, action participatory groups, which is the protocols, right? The ceremony, mentorship, peer teaching, talking circles. There's cathartic art. And these are all things that we incorporated during the pilot project and the rites of passage. And place-based education. So the community presentations and feedback are a very important part of this process, and checking in with participants on a regular basis. So Indigenous research methods are rooted in family and protocols, and of the researcher and the researchee. It's both ways. Whereas in a lot of Western systems, there's a researcher that's hierarchical, and then the researchee. And in these contexts, they're not so hierarchical. They're equals, right? More egalitarian, more like a traditional structure. And the intersectionality of shared culture and heritage. So the community and cultural beliefs, the spirituality and relationality are all part of the research. They're not footnotes. It's actually like the meat of the research. Indigenous research methods are the best way to conduct research that is holistic in scope and that serves the purpose of repairing culture and reclaiming traditional knowledge and practices. This centers the researcher in their own process. So you have the self-growth process that you actually have to go through in this, and creativity, making the researcher a cultural wisdom keeper who will then be responsible for the intergenerational transference of knowledge and gaining through the research. So if you gain through the research, you have to give back. And that's part of the process and reciprocity that we have built into our culture and protocols. Oh, I wrote something here. With this kind of understanding of what Indigenous research is, it can be said that the Tlingit people were all taught to be researchers as the function of basic education and identity of being Tlingit. So Indigenous research methods is our traditional education system. So mentors and teachers, right? Women, Sha. And so we were affectionately calling this building Uski Hit. And today, now that we are talking about women's teachings, it is now Sha Hit. So it's that coming together with our mothers, our aunties, our grandmothers, clan women, our allied clan women, our wise women, and our traditional healers. So women before us speak through us. It's in our DNA. It's in our genetic code. People don't realize that women, when they form the baby in utero, that the eggs for the next generation are actually being formed in the baby. So the grandmother is forming the daughter and the granddaughter at the same time. And so that experience and knowledge is built in, and it's a process of awakening it and accessing it. And that's what we were talking about earlier, that internal and external journey. You have to research, you have to communicate, you have to learn how to listen, and for long periods of time. And you have to be able to meditate on the information. Knowledge of self, inner and outer discipline of self, and fully present state of being. As a good friend once told me, you know, they taught you how to own your own skin and how to be independent and self-fulfilling. Rites of passage is one of the tools for rebuilding culture, healthy people, and strong communities. So high caste women, they're tasked with keeping the cultural knowledge, our history, our genealogy, migration stories, identity, spirituality. It's their task to keep it intact and to share it with the clan and the group. As age increases, so did their identity as keepers and advisors of protocol. So their role in the community was to keep the universe in balance and maintain the fabric of reality. Excuse me, I'm over smiling and over enunciating because this picture is my grandmother. and this woman is Shawat Plain, Meda DeWitt, and she was actually given a second name. And when she was little, her uncle Dick, he would say, Daskawa, Daskawa, come back to me. And he would say that to her all the time. Now, Daskawa is a Nanyai name. It's not a Kachari name. So he didn't give it to her as her formal name. What he did was he was calling Daskawa back in. And so when my daughter was born, actually when she was in utero and being ready to be born, my auntie Linda Ajit and my grandmother Marion Shawat Plain, they approved Daskwa to be named Daskwa. And so she is her namesake. The Daskwa grandmother that she's named after was fiery and was a mountain climber and a hunter. And so these things are part of our traditional knowledge and wisdom. Women live longer and we're built different. When we gather together, we actually create more oxytocin in the brain, which is the bonding hormone. And when we work together, we bond and we release feel good chemicals in our brains. And what research has shown is even when men, not a lot of them, but like if there's one or two and there's a lot of women together and they're working in conjunction with the women, that their oxytocin levels will go up as well. And so that improves their well being too. And we have this process of the woman's house, right? So we built this space. So, what is the women's house? Well, it was a smaller house than the traditional longhouses. We have the traditional longhouses, and then within proximity, there would be a smaller version of the longhouse. And the smaller version of the longhouse, let's end the slideshow here. Okay. So when they would build the smaller houses, it was actually the women's house. So the women, when they would menstruate, they would actually have their own space to be in, and they would spend time together in the woman's house. And women, what we do is we synchronize in our cycles. So women who spend a lot of time together will start to sync up and they'll actually menstruate at the same time. And so what the smaller house was so that women could go be in this space and have time to relax and have time to themselves. Linda, my auntie Ajit, she said, they weren't ashamed. There was nothing wrong with this. They would actually stand out front and tease the other people because they didn't have to work. It was like a vacation every week. They could go and they could, have their herbs and have their space and commune with other women. They didn't have to engage in the work. And so it was a pleasure to be in this space. But on that hand, too, they were also doing spiritual work. They were processing emotions. Women carry the burden of emotions for not only themselves, but their families, their home, their community, and they're communally minded. And so if something is dysfunctional in the community, it weighs on the heart of a woman. And they emote in the process of menstruation and in the women's house. You get to unpack all of these emotions and speak with the other women in this space about what is weighing on your heart. And you get to dialogue about how to fix things. And so it actually created a strong function in the community for the core community health and planning of what to do. And so we're going to go ahead and spend 4 more conversations together about women's house teachings and the rematriation of our culture. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the guys that are helping me here at the museum if there's any questions that have come through. Oh, I'm looking. Excellent. So we have people who are looking forward to this and saying, hi, I'm here. Hello, everybody. I didn't see any of these comments while I was talking the whole time. Wonderful. I'm just scrolling through. Oh no, somebody couldn't get into the conversation. Oh, I see that. So somebody, oh, Judy, so the Haida and Tsimshian, did they have women's houses? From my understanding, yes, this was fairly common for the women in Southeast. And part of it is because we had similar building styles, and that's because we lived in the same ecoregion. We have temperate coastal rainforests, throughout the panhandle of Alaska and BC into the Washington area. And so what you'll find is similarity in cultures. And so our building styles was very similar. And the seclusion hut and the women's hut, from what I understand, is similar. And I have to say, from what I understand, because we have to make sure that we don't overstep and say absolutes. This is what it's done in other cultures, because it's actually up to that cultural group to say what is done. So I've done research into other groups, and I can advise in things like, for instance, we're here in Dena'ina territory, and there are written accounts of what happened here. And if Dena'ina women wanted to learn about that, we could talk about that too. Somebody is asking about high caste distinctions in our culture. So there's a difference between, we did have a caste system in Southeast, and we had high caste, we had commoners, and we also had slave class or laborer class. So the high caste didn't do the physical work that the lower caste or the laborer class would do. But their experience was more strict. The protocols were more strict. So, for instance, the laborer class may only have a week in seclusion, whereas the common class to the noble would have longer durations, and then the high caste, which was also the noble caste, would have up to a year. And so if you think about a year in seclusion, there's not a lot of examples of that in present tense. And so the only real example or comparison that I can find in present tense is the cloistered monks in Buddhist temples who are going to serve the Lama. So they will, and I've actually met one, and he's an incredible fellow, but they would seclude and fast in cycles for a year to 2 years. And so if you think about that, our high caste women were held to standards that some of the highest Buddhist monks are held to. So the experience was different. You wouldn't have the physical labor, but the expectations of your behavior and the way that you were supposed to engage with the communities, responsibilities were much higher as well. Oh, we got lots of comments. I'm trying to keep up here. Great feedback. Thank you. Oh, there's people talking about the Gitsan and not hearing specifically about a woman's house. It's not referenced very much. If you go through the literature, I've only seen a couple of references, and there's no pictures. At contact and with that transition to Christianity, menses was treated much differently. So in the colonization concepts of women, it was derogatory and negative and dirty. So there was a huge transition that happened in that space. And so the women's things kind of just, they went away pretty quietly. So somebody wants to know, where's the house located? The house we're actually in the Seed Lab, and we're in downtown Anchorage, and it was the perfect place to build. And it's not open to the public right now because of COVID-19, but we will be taking lots of pictures, and I can tell you it smells like cedar. So I wish I had smell-o-vision for you. Are there women's rites of passage ceremonies still happening? There are a few. So there's families who work to put women through women's rites of passage with some adaptations. Um, let's see, what does it look like for women who are not coming of age, who didn't have access to ceremonies when they were coming of age, but revitalizing ceremonies in their families? That's a great question. So I mentioned the pilot project that we did in 2012. All the women that were part of that were adults. And actually, Margaret DeWitt and I were both pregnant at that time. She was actually more pregnant though. And we had a modified meal. We went through some of the protocols, but because of our adaptations, we can't just jump straight into the way that things were done 100% traditionally. It would be too harsh. And that's one of the big things that going through this process and looking at the different aspects is you have to have that self-governance and the will to want to go through this process. If you were just to take somebody and put them in seclusion and not give them food, I mean, that's abuse, it's torture, right? So you can't just take somebody and throw them in there and tell them then that they're going to do that thing for a long time. So it's when you come to that point in yourself, hosting that space and having your family members and your clan members hosting that space and supporting you through that process. There are a few women that I know that have gone through more traditional rites of passage where they had a modified diet and were in seclusion for a week at a time. And one of the stories that I can share with you that was shared by Margaret Grosshope, she gave me permission to share this one, is she I started interviewing her, and she was the Natla for the Siknachadi, which is a sister clan to the Nanyai. She's also my great aunt, and my baby name was her mother's name, so we have that relationship. And I started talking about rites of passage, and at first she's like, "Oh, I don't know what that is. We didn't do that. That's something that went away before my time." And so we just started talking, right? And I was like, well, this is what I've learned so far. And I kind of just explained to her the literature review and the stories, and I shared them with her. And as I'm unpacking this information, she, kind of leaned in and she was listening real hard. And I got to a point where she wanted to say something, so I paused, and she says, I went through that and I never knew it until now. So this was, she just passed away a few years ago. And this was a conversation that we had in 2011 or 2012. And she said that her mom had put her in her room. She put her to bed and she put a sheet across the room. And nobody was allowed to come in that space. Just her brothers and sisters were able to come in on the other side of the sheet and talk to her. And she said, I wasn't allowed to have anything good to eat, nothing that tasted good. And her mom had her in there for a week, but did not tell her what was going on and told her that she could not tell anybody. And so it was a gift to see her in her elder years realizing that her mother had put her through her traditional rites of passage and that she went through that ceremony, and that was gifted to her by her mother. But it was back when everything had to be quiet, when the Alaska Native Sisterhood was working hard to make sure that our houses were in order, and we were working hard to gain rights to vote and to integrate. And so those things, they were put away or they were done very quietly. And so it is appropriate for adult women to go through this process. And my education on rites of passage by working with elder women and hosting the pilot project, that was my coming of age. And I was 32 years old when I finally had my coming of age process. And I think that as we go through this, we have to be gentle with each other. We have to be kind, and we cannot hold so much judgment. And so if If you are an adult woman, I would say do it. And if you want to have a conversation about different reasons why things were done, we can. And also, like I said, we'll be having 5 talks total, 4 more on this topic with people. And Makamantur Paki will be joining me. And she went through a traditional rites of passage that was hosted by her grandmother. So I hope that you join with us on that one too. Okay, let's see here, more questions. Yeah, processing community emotions does hit hard, doesn't it? That's part of, it's part of women, and it's a burden, but it's also a gift. And that's one of the reasons why women make good leaders, is because we are wired to think communally. And it does weigh on our hearts when other parts of the community are disparaged, or don't have adequate rights or adequate food or adequate housing. Not that men don't, a lot of men care, but women are just maternally wired in that way. Well, not all of them. There's a few that aren't. I don't want to make too many generalities, but in the normative biological processing, the way our brains think is we're communally wired. Okay, good comments and good conversations in here. Were high caste women selected, or class distinctions? You were born into it. It is family. It's family lineage. So it's your clan, it's your family, it's your bloodline. And we also have stories, though, of people who were labor class who did noble deeds that were then elevated to high class. And that was definitely possible to transition within the castes. Not easy, but definitely possible, and it did happen. So we're now coming up to the end. And now these questions are popping in. Yes, there were some ceremonies around menopause, not the same ceremonies, but we'll have some women in to talk about that when later. I'm not the expert on that one yet. Yes, there is spiritual growth in the rites of passage, and we're actually going to talk about that more in a later session. But there is a process that happens in the brain where you release chemicals when you're in a dark space for a long period of time that actually helps to induce visioning. And part of the process of when you're in seclusion is you're supposed to be meditating, and you're supposed to be praying and meditating on what do you want to be when you grow up, and who do you want to be, what kind of a person do you want to be. And that was definitely, I talked about the intergenerational transference of knowledge. There was also that interspiritual transference from creator and spirit and ancestors. So thank you, everybody. I'm grateful that you came to be with me in the Women's House today. And it's an exciting process. And this in itself has been a rites of passage. So Ganesh Cheesh.